This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Carlson Center for Christian Worldview.
Ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. Welcome to BreakPoint This Week, where we talk every week about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview. Joined here with Warren Smith. I'm John Stonestreet. Warren, the event, and I'm tempted to use some sarcastic language like, the train wreck of the week or whatever, but
Right.
That's just cynical. I decided, oftentimes during election season, I'll hop on and live tweet, because it's some of these, political events, because it's too hard for me to resist using my spiritual gift of sarcasm for good. And that is such an easy environment to do it on both sides of the aisle, by the way.
Yep.
But I didn't. I was traveling. And so I'm looking mostly at highlights, but some interesting moments of back-to-back nights of the Democratic candidates' first debate. One of my favorites was a guy kind of tweeting a picture of a guy and saying, "I've never seen this person before in my life," and that's what you've got, I think, with a lot of Americans and
Right.
some of these candidates going, "Who is this person?" But then, of course, you also have the Joe Bidens and the Bernie Sanders and the Kamala Harris and so on. And at least the Thursday night one had a little bit of fireworks in it.
Well, that's right. And let me, first of all, John, say that every time you say that your spiritual gift is sarcasm, we always get letters chastising us as if we didn't know that sarcasm was not really a spiritual gift. So just for the record, let's just say we know that that is a joke. But, I think that a couple of things that I took away. Number one, you're exactly right. There were folks on the stage that I wouldn't say I had no idea who they were, but they were definitely way down the list in terms of being a known commodity. But I think that it's important that we not be too glib about that, because you could have said the same thing about the Republicans 4 years ago, that there was a cast of dozens that were vying for the election, and it turned out that one of those ended up being elected president of the United States, Donald Trump, and nobody thought that he had a real chance probably this time 4.5 years ago. So there's that. The other thing that I took away from the presidential debates, John, was just how far to the left the Democratic Party has become. Now, I know that the primary debates are often intra-party conversations, that it's an appeal to the base, or it's an opportunity for these candidates to try to build a base around them, and often they take positions on the Democratic side that are more liberal than the party as a whole, and on the Republican side more conservative than the Republican Party. But I was stunned by just how liberal, how quote-unquote progressive virtually all of these candidates were. I didn't see a moderate candidate in the bunch. I mean, you could say Joe Biden might come as close to being a moderate as you get in the Democratic Party, but he was lambasted by virtually all the other candidates on the stage.
Yeah, and he's lambasted, I think, for two reasons. One is he's the front runner, and they're trying to really put a chink in his armor here going into the real campaigning season. And I think they did that. I actually think Thursday night, Kamala Harris's challenge, and Biden's got some skeletons in his closet given the new culture, the new climate of identity politics. And the kind of have to walk the party line, and you already have a strike against you if you're an old white guy. And we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but again, he is the most moderate individual in the bunch, and they took a lot of shots at him because they want him out of the way as the front runner, and because he's got some real liability for that party. Look, it was clear that there was a run to the left. I mean, we had a strange moment where I think Julian Castro, trying to be politically correct, ended up advocating abortion rights for men when he advocated. I've been trying to do the math on this. I mean, it's hard to keep track, but tell me if I'm wrong on this. But he basically said, first of all, he threw that line out to not just the base. I mean, this panders to kind of the hyper base, right? And he threw out a line about not just reproductive rights, reproductive justice. And then he went on to say, including for trans women. I try to keep track of these things. I think a trans woman is a man who identifies as a woman. What he meant to say is a trans man, because the one you would need abortion rights for would be a biological woman identifying as a man, not a biological. Am I right?
No, you're right.
This is new math. It's hard to keep up.
Well, it is, but I mean, someone who can actually get pregnant, in other words, is the one that I think that he intended to advocate for. But again, for me, John, another example of just sort of how radical and how quote unquote progressive. I hate to dishonor the word progressive by you using it in this case, but we'll just use it because that's the word that's being used. How radical and how progressive these candidates have become. They, and in fact, so far out there that they, and your comments highlighted it, they failed to pass what I have heard called the reality test. That the positions they advocate for are, just not positions that you can implement in a real world. And that was my biggest takeaway from the evening.
Now, I'm going to admit that one of the best pieces of analysis, if we get to the kind of the meta 30,000-foot level, I mean, obviously they ran to the left part of the stage in the left part of the world as quickly as possible. But there's a similarity here between this round and 2016 where the Republicans had so many candidates in. And I actually, we're going to talk about getting hate letters. I appreciated an analyst on the New York Times podcast who helped me think through this. And I know that's not usually where I get kind of deep political information. When we talk about kind of the worldview issues behind this, there's no question whatsoever that it couldn't be as far to the left as possible. That if, for those wondering what's going to happen in the next election, you need to take a very clear account not only about what's happened at the Supreme Court under the Trump administration, but how far to the left, specifically on abortion and LGBT rights, that these candidates have been running. But here's the commonality. Like in 2016, you've got a mix of new candidates and old candidates. You've got a mix of people that are somewhat moderate and those that are to the extreme of the party's platform. But you've also got a mix of those who think the system can be fixed and the system needs to be blown up. When you hear, for example, Elizabeth Warren, that she's saying, I think the most common phrase in her stump speeching so far is we need systemic change. If you hear guys like Cory Booker, kind of this new voice in the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, certainly that woman last night who was saying some really, really strange things. She was on the far left of the stage, and Marianne, I'll just let that one go. That was bizarre. But when you see that, and then you've got a guy like Biden who's saying, no, we don't need to roll back everything. We need to tweak here and there. And that's really where he's landing on. That's fascinating because if you go back to 2016, you had the same thing just on the right, that there were people who thought, well, we need to adjust the system. We need to do politics as normal. We need to do government as normal. And then you had a couple candidates, but one candidate that rose to the top that said, no, we got to blow the whole thing up and start over. So that's going to be the question. And he was able to mobilize a big enough base. And so the question is, just on a political level, where's the Democratic Party going to land? Are they going to get behind the front runner and be okay with just kind of a tweaking of the system, or are they going to go kind of more for the nuclear option? And then the question is, and I think in terms of for the election, the question is, can they get all back on the same team? The exchange last night between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, there was anger there. There was bitterness there. This reminds you of Ted Cruz, Donald Trump exchanges during the run-up to the 2016 election. And eventually they all got back on the same page. But one wonders if the younger members of the Democratic Party who are pushing for such radical leftist positions, if they're going to be able to ever get behind Joe Biden, and if their base is going to be able to get behind Joe Biden if he remains the front runner. That to me is the interesting thing to watch. And I feel like, there's that meme that goes around Facebook of Michael Jackson eating popcorn at the theater in the Thriller video. And he's just kind of feeding it in going, I'm just watching this. I mean, that's obviously how I think a lot of us feel, that aren't part of the progressive side of things. But that to me is what the real question is. Which of those two ideas are going to rise to the top?
Yeah, I think that's right, John, and that's the problem that the Democrats have to face. But I think that those of us who do not share the ideology of the Democratic Party, those of us who care about life, who care about religious liberty, who care about marriage and the biblical understanding of those, are going to have to do more than, just watch it with popcorn in our laps. We are going to have to get actively involved because while, John, we talk about this all the time here at the Carlson Center, that politics is downstream from culture, which is mostly true, that outrage is not a strategy, that salvation will not fly in on Air Force One. I do think on the other side of that coin, it's important to remember that at least in the 21st century, life and death questions are being decided as a result of our political process. And those of us who take the Bible seriously and take a Christian worldview seriously really do need to get involved.
Well, you're listening to BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
BreakPoint is a ministry of the Carlson Center, and we are supported by listeners like you. If you find the daily content that comes through our BreakPoint commentaries and our podcast episodes helpful, and that helps you develop a Christian worldview and engage the culture around you, we need your help to keep BreakPoint coming to you. Just come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there at the top of the page that says Give. Again, that's breakpoint.org. Click the button that says Give, and become a supporter of the Carlson Center and the content of BreakPoint. Thank you.
Well, we're back on BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Let's go to sports. Let's go from politics to sports. Why not? Jesus is in charge of every square inch, right?
That's right.
We did a BreakPoint this past week and a point this past week that are really the same story, just on opposite sides of the world. And one had to do with the Women's World Cup, which, you know, is a pretty big sporting event worldwide, and that there's a player on the U.S. team that many think are missing, not because she didn't have the talent to make the team, but because she had what we've been calling around the Carlson Center for a while, theology of getting fired. I guess if we're going to talk about sports teams, we should have a theology of getting cut. And then, kind of at the same time, he has emerged a story out of Australia with one of the best international rugby players on the planet. I'm not a rugby fan, but you've seen this guy's face if you've, even watched the highlight video of the, kind of the best hits in the Rugby World Cup. Plays for Australia, Israel Folau. And I guess if we were going to do this show down in Australia, we'd have to call it a theology of getting sacked, because that's the the language down there. And both of them lost their positions. Well, look, we know Israel Folau lost his position. That's clear. The rumor is whether Jaelene Hinkle lost her position on the women's U.S. soccer team for the same reason, and it has to do with deeply held Christian convictions.
Well, that's exactly right. In the case of Jaelene Hinkle, first of all, we should say that women's soccer, there's been kind of an undercurrent for years about women's soccer. I guess you could say rumors. In some cases, not rumors. Many of the members of the team are openly gay, and many of them are married to same-sex partners. So in some ways, the women's soccer team has been they've been heroes to the LGBTQ community, or at least some aspects of that community. They were going to play a match that required them to wear a pride jersey. And you'll see sports teams do this from time to time. If it's, breast cancer week, all the National League baseball players will wear pink socks or something like that. So it's not so unusual for these kinds of things to happen, but Jaelene Hinkle refused to wear a gay pride jersey. That happened actually a while ago, John, but it's because the women's national team is making a run here in the World Cup for the championship that this story has emerged again. And some people say that Jaelene should be on that team. In fact, a whole lot of people say that she should be on that team, and that in fact, especially for her particular skill set, she would fill a gap in the skill set of the national team. So, we have an example of a young woman who, because she stood on her convictions, is off the team, and even if it cost the Women's World Cup team the championship, they were willing to make that ideological decision to keep her off the team.
And we're not sure if it's, for those reasons. It's suspicious. There's plenty of people that have looked at the team, like you said, and said she'd be a great fit and she'd be a necessary fit. But the head coach cut her and cited what she called footballing reasons. A lot of people are skeptical about that, simply because she's a married lesbian, and some of the prominent players in the team are also out as lesbian. But along this line is this interesting survey that came out this past week that shows that at least people have stalled overall in their tolerance of LGBTQ individuals. Now, this is a fascinating report from the Harris poll, because there is this narrative. We heard it after Roe v. Wade, and we certainly heard it after the Obergefell decision and during this whole thing, that younger people are more and more accepting of LGBT. They don't have the same sort of kind of old fuddy-duddy moral stances on these things, and, old people on the wrong side of history on some of these issues and so on. But it actually showed that the number of Americans 18 to 34 who are comfortable interacting with LGBTQ people slipped from 53% in 2017 to 45% in 2018. And that's down from 63% in 2016. Driving the dilution of acceptance, according to the report, are young women whose overall comfort levels plunged. So young women in particular. Now, I think there's a lot behind this. And right now, this is all going to be kind of speculation because the survey doesn't tell you why or where people are uncomfortable. I think there's at least 2 or 3 things at work here. And Warren, you can speak into this too. Mm-hmm. One is something that we've been talking about. It's interesting to me that young women, that their comfort level has plunged because we have seen an uptick in transgender attacking sacred kind of feminist thought. I mean, you had many of those that are in the L in the acronym are second-wave feminists. They have a deeply held belief that men are what's wrong with the world and that men keep women out and that men cannot understand the female experience. And now we have a group of men identifying as women, appropriating that experience in a way that our culture has decided if it were African American appropriation or if it were, Asian appropriation or anything like that in a Halloween costume, it would be wrong. And now we have men kind of appropriating the full-on female look, feel, experience, kind of hyper gender stereotypes and so on. And also now entering into sports. And so I wonder, for example, what the response is for those who have been booing Jaelene Hinkle for her outspoken beliefs against homosexuality when a transgender player decides that they're going to take a position on the World Cup team from a woman. So I think that's at least one thing. The other thing is I think something that you brought to my attention is something that Brett McCracken, who's a senior editor at the Gospel Coalition, basically making the comparison that the LGBTQ movement has become fundamentalist. And fundamentalism doesn't sit well, but it really has become fundamentalist. Describe what he talked about there, because that's a fascinating point to me.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating point, too. He said, in Hollywood especially, but he said that Hollywood once preached tolerance and open-mindedness, but now, in large part because of the LGBTQ orthodoxy, it doesn't allow for any dissent. And I think that's a really fascinating insight. And he gave a particular example. Lesbian actor Ellen Page, who's been in all kinds of movies, including Inception, which was a very popular movie a few years ago, recently criticized a Christian actor named Chris Pratt because he attends a church in Los Angeles, a church that believes that marriage should be between one man and one woman. So just the very fact that Chris Pratt attends that church made him vulnerable to criticism from this lesbian actor and activist, Ellen Page. And John, to me, that fundamentalism is spilling over into bullying. And I think that that's one of the reasons why that young people in particular may be rethinking their acceptance of the LGBTQ movement. The LGBTQ movement for 50 years has done a really masterful job of painting themselves as a victim, as painting themselves as a subset of the population that is being bullied by those in power. And I think that that has actually been a pretty effective strategy for them. But now they are becoming the bullies in the public conversation. With in this case with Jaelene Hinkle that we've talked about, in the case of Ellen Page bullying Chris Pratt. And I think that that narrative is just not sitting well with young people, that they were willing to accept that even if they didn't agree with the LGBTQ position on many things, but now that they become the bully, I think that that's why we're seeing some of the support erode.
Yeah, I think those are two of the factors. I think there's a third, and that is, and again, it goes back to the T kind of and the Q hijacking this movement, that I think it's one thing when people, the American public, have kind of believed the narrative, which isn't true, by the way, but they believe the narrative that, what happens in someone's bedroom is what happens in someone's bedroom and so on. Now, I think, we often talk about folks like Patiram Sorokin and Joseph Unwin and others who talk about kind of the very public consequences of sexual norms in a society and how that has a lot to do with whether a society is what we would call an idealistic or ideational society or a sensate, living out of the senses in the moment, and so on. So this is a big sociological conversation. But the T and the Q part of this acronym, one of the things that does is it takes what you could sell as a kind of a private act in a bedroom between consenting adults, and suddenly it becomes drag queen story hour at the public library. And the bullying part, as you mentioned, is one thing. I think the conflict specifically between the T and the L is the other. But then there's also the, the stories that we're hearing over and over and over of Drag Queen Story Hour, of basically celebrating and sexualizing a 9-year-old transgender boy who's dancing in front of men in a provocative way. We see these stories, and it just is going over the line now. It's no longer private. It's now in your face, at every single level. And I think that there's still enough of that, what should we call it? The law written on our heart, the things we can't not know, that, people can't even kind of articulate it, but they're just not comfortable with it. I think that's an interesting point, and I'm wondering, if there is going to be a unified L to Q movement, start to finish, in the days ahead, or if some of these rifts in the movement that are, little cracks in the movement are going to become full-out rifts. It's going to be interesting to watch. Well, you're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
The end of the fiscal year for the Colson Center is June 30. Help us begin our next fiscal year strong and help us keep the content of BreakPoint and the training programs of the Colson Center coming your way. Just go to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the page that says Give. Again, that's breakpoint.org. Click Give to support the work of the Colson Center. I'm John Stonestreet.
Well, we're back on BreakPoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. Well, we're going to go from politics to sports to science, because there's just a couple things that have, I think, been released this past year that are worthy of mentioning. Well, one of the gods of our age, we just finished up our short course, Warren, and one of our guest instructors for one of the gods of our age that we identified as scientism was Dr. J.P. Moreland, just kind of the eminent philosopher. What a remarkable guy, has influenced an enormous amount of people to a life of Christian scholarship and apologetics, but has written a phenomenal book on what we would call the God of scientism. But here's what I mean when I say the God of scientism. What we identified in our short course was that there are 4 or 5, and I think we could have added a few more, things in Western culture that take the place of God in very specific ways. So, thou shalt have no other God before me. From God now becomes, I will have no other God before me. That self kind of takes the ultimate place. And even God's rules have to be reaccommodated according to many who are misguided to accommodate our own kind of wishes and self-identifications and so on and so on and so on. The God of stuff, Pascal's famous God-shaped hole becomes a Lexus-shaped hole, in our cultural moment. The science one, to me, is just the definitive, authoritative way that science kind of claims that things are settled, right? The science is settled is the new way of saying, thus saith the Lord, in our culture. And, of course, we see it around things like climate change. We see it around things like LGBTQ ideology. We see it around things around the abortion issue and so on. But also in the power of taking religious truth and taking it out of the realm of truth and making it private as if it doesn't actually reflect the real world. And so science then becomes the ultimate arbiter of truth. And I think there's been a couple fantastic resources produced just in the last year that deal with this. And I think it's something that our listeners and Christians in general need to know about. The God of scientism, and J.P. Moreland's book is one of those.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, John. And, of course, we had John Lennox at the Wilberforce weekend who spoke about these issues, too, and he was just really brilliant, and we had him on the podcast this week, so I would commend our listeners to go back and check that out as well to hear his presentation from our Wilberforce weekend. But I think one of the resources that you're talking about is from the Discovery Institute. The Discovery Institute has a new series of short videos called Science Uprising that directly confronts the false views of science, and we should distinguish, I think, between science and scientism. Science has been a wonderful, beautiful, helpful discipline for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and Christian thinkers have contributed significantly to the field of science over the years. It is when science becomes ideology, when science becomes scientism, that we start to have problems. And of course, today we have people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye, the science guy he calls himself, who I think are prominent purveyors of this scientism, which I would call not true science, but a corruption of science. And these are specifically the men that this new video series, Science Uprising, is designed to confront and to refute.
Yeah, it does it in a really clever, creative way. It reminds me a lot of the kind of the style, or at least the intent of the style of the Acton Institutes for the Life of the World. It's just a great way to communicate. Is fantastic. If you come to breakpoint.org and click on the link that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, we will link you to where you can find the Science Uprising video series and a terrific book by J.P. Moreland on scientism at the same place, as well as some of the other things that we talked about on today's program, including the Breakpoint and the Point on the sports figures that were this week dismissed from their teams and what's behind some of that. So again, come to breakpoint.org. And also let me remind you that this is the last weekend of the fiscal year. Many of you have come behind us and supported us with financial donations to help us go into the next fiscal year strong. And we need some more of you to do that. And consider being a monthly supporter if you appreciate the weekly content that comes to the podcast, to the radio, to your email box, to the website, from the Carlson Center, whether it's the daily Breakpoint commentaries or these weekly conversations about what's happening in the culture. Consider making a donation to support this work. We would be very grateful as we continue to try to bring the clarity of a Christian worldview, helping people see things like, for example, that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. Well, for Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. We'll be back again next week to talk about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview. We'll see you next time.